Good morning. We would like to welcome you on this webinar, which is designed to lead you through the main steps companies need to complete it when they are entering on foreign markets. My name is Antonia Maurova. I am heading the automotive practice of King's Taylor, and together with my colleague Nina Tifulina, who is heading the corporate and M&A practice of King's Taylor in Sofia, and our colleague Larissa Guttuneanu, who is leading the IT and cybersecurity practice of King's Taylor, will give you a lot of useful example, I believe, how company expands on foreign markets. In our presentation, we took as by way of example 6 countries, but we believe that the examples we are giving you may be spread to all other countries and may be useful for you and will give you awareness what you need to consider when you are expanding on foreign markets. Just to give you a summary how the presentation will go, we have 3 topics. The first topic will be covered by Nina. It's structuring of investment vehicle. I'll be speaking about your awareness of state incentives. And Clarice is covering also a very hot topic regarding the cybersecurity. At the end, we will show you a short movie about a company which is expanding on a market and became one of the most successful companies on this foreign market. I hope you will enjoy the presentation, and meanwhile we will try to address some of your questions which we are allowed to submit online. So I give the floor to Nina now and wish you a pleasant 1 hour with us.
Good morning, everyone.
We're trying to run the presentation. Hopefully this will happen soon.
Okay. Amongst the first questions investors should ask when expanding in a new market is what is the appropriate corporate form for their local establishment? To answer this question, various important aspects are usually weighted, such as tax matters, the need to seek local permits and licenses, transfer of hard and local currency, bank account opening, hiring employees. The investors should have the ability to do all things locally, which are generally needed to run their business. Whether to choose a branch or a local company. In our experience, often tax advisors come to the conclusion that both branch and local subsidiary are a viable option. From legal perspective, both options could also work. However, using a local subsidiary may be a preferred option due to the limited liability of its local operations. Such liability would be attributable to the local entity only. This limitation would not be possible if you choose to establish a branch. The branch is not a separate legal entity. On one hand, it is part of the parent company, and thus issues like a financing or transfer of copyrights would be relatively straightforward. In order to ensure the positive cash flow of the branch, money may be transferred without intergroup loans. However, if legal proceedings are brought against the branch, the parent company would be fully liable for the branch's obligations, which in our experience tends to be problematic for multinationals with many suppliers and employees. This is the main disadvantage of the branch structure. When talking about limited liability of the subsidiary, investors should have in mind that piercing the corporate veil concept exists in some countries. For example, this concept exists in Serbia, Albania, and Latvia. This means that in some cases, the parent company can be held liable for the obligations of the local subsidiary. In Serbia, for example, this can happen if the shareholder is using company property as its own property. In Albania, The liability of the company can be extended to its shareholders if it's proved that the subsidiary is accustomed to act in accordance with the directions or instructions of the parent company. In Latvia, a shareholder in a limited liability company can be personally held liable if the shareholder committed illegal actions and, as a result, the company suffered losses, provided that the company cannot fulfill its obligations against creditors. Also, shareholders in the so-called small capital companies in Latvia, those with registered capital of less than 2,800 euros, can become directly liable. If the company cannot pay its creditors, the shareholders are personally liable for the difference between the actually paid capital and the amount of 2,800 euros. How long does it take to register a branch or a local subsidiary? Here you can see that in terms of timing, there is no much difference in the registration of a branch or a local company. We took, for example, 6 countries in our region, including Latvia. Generally, in all these countries, there is no major difference between a subsidiary and a branch in terms of opening a bank account, obtaining licenses, except for a few exceptions, hiring employees, or entering into commercial contracts. The costs and the tax registration are also similar. Note that across European Union, in the next couple of years, there will be online company registers in all EU countries, so it will be very faster to actually incorporate either a branch or a company on a new country. But if you decide to go for a company, how can you choose the right kind of company that best suits your business needs? The main legal aspects to be considered by the investors when choosing the appropriate type of company are the minimum capital requirements, the corporate governance, which is the number of directors, flexible decision-making, and day-to-day management. All these are more or less related to the costs for running the business. Another aspect is the financial assistance and capital maintenance rules. Under financial assistance, we mean restrictions of the company to finance directly or indirectly the purchase of the company's shares. The capital maintenance rules refer to the minimum requirements for financial stability of the company. An usual indicator here is the net asset value of the company. For some investors, it may be important whether the name of the shareholders are public. Please note that in relation to the increased measures for prevention of money laundering, the requirements for disclosure of shareholders' names, as well as the names of the ultimate beneficial owners of a company, become more and more stringent across EU. Audit and reporting requirements are also important, as again, they affect the administrative costs for running the local business. Traditionally, higher standards apply to joint stock company, as usually they have more shareholders which are not directly involved in the daily business of the company. We will focus our presentation on the two most often used corporate forms, and these are the limited liability company and the joint stock company. In the table, you can see the minimum capital for a limited liability company and a joint stock company required in the 6 exemplary countries that we focus on. Except for Romania, both types of companies can be set up as wholly owned subsidiaries, with a foreign company being the sole shareholder. In Romania, this is also possible for limited liability companies. However, chaining restrictions apply there, and a limited liability company cannot have a sole shareholder which is already a sole shareholder in another limited liability company, either in Romania or abroad, or which is itself owned by a sole shareholder. The joint stock company reveals more options for structuring an equity investment, since different classes of shares can be used, such as preferred shares or redeemable shares. No such possibilities exist for the shares in a limited liability company. Their capital is usually divided in quotas rather than shares, where the quotas are not individually issued to the shareholder. Capital maintenance rules apply to both joint stock company and limited liability companies and are designed actually to prevent the shareholders from having recourse to the company's capital throughout the existence of the company. However, usually stricter rules apply to joint stock companies than to limited liability companies. For example, in Bulgaria, radical consequences are envisaged in case the net assets of a joint stock company falls below the amount of the registered capital and the loss is not recoverable within the statutory term. In such case, the public prosecutor may request the court to initiate compulsory liquidation of the company. Now, let's see what are the differences in the corporate governance. In all limited liability companies in Bulgaria, Romania, and Albania, as you will see on this slide, you can have one or more managing directors who manage the company and represent it before third parties. In Romania, if the limited liability company has several directors, the articles may envisage that they act as a board or board of directors similar to that of a joint stock company. Only individuals can be directors in a limited liability company in those three countries, while there are no requirements for them to be also local citizens. A joint stock company may have a board of directors in case of a one-tier board structure, or in case of a two-tier board structure, which is more complex, you should have a supervisory board and a managing board. In Bulgaria and Romania, as directors of joint stock companies can be appointed also other companies. In all these countries, the limited liabilities daily management is flexible and simple as it does not require collective decision-making as opposed to the board structure of corporate governance. The latter, however, has the advantage to provide stronger mechanisms for control over the operational management. It is worth mentioning that in Albania there are special restrictions for directors of the parent company to become also directors at the subsidiary level. This may cause some difficulties for investors when appointing the local management. Also, in case of one-tier board structure, the majority of directors should be independent, meaning that they are not in financial relationship with the company and does not have conflict of interests. In Romania, members of the management bodies, irrespective of the chosen system of corporate governance, must not be employees of the company during their mandate as directors. In Bulgaria, likewise, directors can only be hired under service or management agreements and not as regular employees. In Serbia, Macedonia, and Latvia, both corporate forms have similar governance structure, one or two-tier, whereas in a limited liability company, usually the directors does not act as a board. In case of a joint stock company where 3 or more directors are appointed, a board of directors should be formed. As you will see, in Macedonia and Latvia, only individuals can be appointed as directors. Again, there are no restrictions as to the citizenship of the directors. In Serbia, also legal entities could act as directors of local companies, but in this case, those should be legal entities registered in Serbia. In this table, we try to summarize other useful information which prove to be important for investors when deciding the form of their local vehicle. You can see that in terms of visibility of shareholders, there are not much difference between both types of companies across the 6 countries. Yet in Bulgaria, Macedonia, and Latvia, the names of the shareholders in a joint stock company are not listed in the company register. Note that this is not true for Bulgarian joint stock companies having only one shareholder, as well as for shareholders holding more than 5% in Macedonian joint stock companies. Both types of companies could be subject to mandatory audit, as it is now more and more often depends on the size of the business and the turnover. However, in Bulgaria, Serbia, and Albania, joint stock companies are subject to mandatory audit in all cases, even if they qualify as a small enterprise. Other reporting requirements. Here we mean different reporting or disclosure requirements, such as preparing an annual activity report by the management, quarterly reporting, or other information relating to financial performance. In all 6 countries, such special requirements apply to joint stock companies only. For example, in Macedonia, joint stock companies are required to disclose a variety of information about their financial performance, operations, and general information, allowing investors to form an opinion about the company and its securities. This information must be made available on the company's website, and it is easily accessible on the website of the Macedonian Stock Exchange and the Securities and Exchange Commission. In Serbia, the situation is more or less similar. Due to the flexible management structure, lower capital requirements, and reporting obligations, limited liability companies are by far the most common type used by investors when entering new markets. On the other hand, although a joint stock company requires higher initial capital, its shares are individually issued and registered to the respective shareholder, and the corporate governance structure ensures greater shareholder control. It is also subject to mandatory audit and other reporting requirements. This issue may be of lesser focus when investors intend to solely own the entity. If, however, an investor decides to bring in a partner or form a joint venture, which is very often seen when entering new markets, and in this case, the joint stock company may be the recommended form. And now I would like to give the floor to my colleague Antonia, and would happy to answer any questions you have after the end of the presentation.
As mentioned in the beginning, I'll be speaking about your awareness of state incentives. Upon entering a foreign market, one of the first points to be considered is whether state incentives are available. Why this question is so important? We believe that the awareness of the state incentives is really of key importance, because through these state incentives, the state is facilitating the expansion of the company on foreign markets. The state is creating also a user-friendly environment, and least but not least, you may save money. In our days, the government is usually supporting activities which are bringing value, which are creative and innovative. To this end, it's not surprising that the industry, which is very much supported by the state in the 6 countries we are overseeing now, but also in other jurisdictions, is the high technology company, the innovation company, the research and development centers. For some of the jurisdictions, for example, like Serbia, industrial and service sectors are also protected. In any case, the company should add value and also facilitate a transfer of knowledge. Upon determining the key factor relevant for specifying the state incentives, we need to start with the location. Yes, again, location of the investment. And this is not surprising, because the region with less population or high rate of employment are usually the regions which are mainly benefiting from the state incentives. The parameters of the investments are also as of key importance. In case the investment is considerable, very understandable, the amount of the state incentive will be also more favorable. The second topic you should have in mind when we are speaking about state incentive, this is the discussion with the competent government authorities. On this slide, we have tried to show you that in each of the jurisdictions there is such state authorities which is facilitating the communication with the new investor. Once you are aware that such state incentives are available, usually we recommend our client to start a dialogue with the competent authorities. It is only within such a discussion that the investor will understand more about the available state incentive. Moreover, we note that in some cases the state incentives represent a package which is very much tailored to the specific parameters of the investment. I will give you an example showing how important is the communication with the state authorities. It is like a legend which is now regarding the Kia automotive car producer and their decision taking how to choose the location for their new OEM facility. The choice was between Slovakia and Poland, and both locations were very much advanced with their proposal to the investor. However, in maybe some of the last conversation of the authorities in Slovakia with Kia, the Prime Minister made a proposal to the investor they couldn't resist. He suggests to become the project manager of Kia in Slovakia and to allow the investors to call him upon each occasion when something goes wrong or, for example, there is a delay. Surprisingly, this was the key decision factor of Kia to choose Slovakia before Poland. So you can see how important it is to communicate with the government authorities and to understand what exactly they can offer you, because this cannot be included in the law. For the turning of the state incentives, usually the authorities are requesting information regarding the investment. What is the site of the investment? What is the region of the implementation? What is the sector of the economy? Each country is acting with his own legislation, but as a general principle, the countries are trying to treat equally the foreign investor compared to the local investor. By way of example, in Bulgaria we have categorization of the investment in certain classes. We have class A, B, C, which is more local, and priority investments, which are some investments of a very key importance, and which investments will ensure growth. Similar approach is also available, for example, in Romania, whereas the investment have a major impact on the economy and are creating new jobs, for example. It is important also for some of the jurisdictions to check whether a bilateral protection treaty is available and whether there is an option to give the investor like a special status. For example, in Albania, we can see this most favored nation status. Which are the most common type of incentives which are available? As the first point, these are the acquisition of property rights over state property. Usually, when a new facility is established, it's very important for the investor to understand whether it will be allowed by the respective law to buy the land and to develop the respective facility. That's why the acquisition of the property rights is usually given by the state, like an option to the investor, which will attract him to choose one location before another. For example, in Bulgaria, we can give you an example. The decision to construct a paper mill was very much triggered by the fact that the investor was allowed to buy the land on a preferred prices without passing a tender procedure, and this was something like a decision triggering for this investment. Other factors which are very much important, like and are provided by the states, like type of incentives. For example, the infrastructure, which is not very well developed on some of our jurisdiction, is something which the investor consider not very feasible. That's why the government are often offering the investor they to make the construction and the infrastructure, and in this way to facilitate the communication and the logistics for the respective incentives. Due to the increased demand for IT specialists and engineers, which qualification is very important for the IT companies, also for the automotive sectors and for the greenfield investment. For example, in Bulgaria, the Bulgarian state has started a special cooperation with the university by providing program and financial support for education of people with the respective profile, so that this profile match the demand of the investor. And this is very relevant again for some of the industry you are representing. Some of the countries are providing also tax exemption. This is also very important. For example, Serbia is providing the so-called tax holiday, which gives the investor the possibility to benefit from tax exemption program in order to facilitate their activities on the respective market. For example, some of the countries like Macedonia are even considering a tax exemption for the development of the R&D centers, which the Macedonian government is considering like a good incentive to the investor to choose Macedonia before other locations. I mentioned the technical infrastructure, which is of key importance, but also last but not least, these are the reimbursement of the investment cost the investor is making in new machinery and equipment. As a follow-up of what we discussed about how important is the communication between the investor and the investment agency, we will give you some insights about what are the points which need to be considered and why it's so important to request an investment proposal to be made by the state authorities. An investment proposal means that, first of all, when you disclose to the state authorities the parameters of the respective investment, you will be advised by the respective authorities about the percentage of the state incentives they can provide you. But please take into consideration a few things. First of all, this is not always a direct financial support. This could be just a cost saving. For example, if the state allow you to buy a land which will be on preferred prices, actually the amount of the state incentives will be calculated like the difference between the market price of the respective land and the price you are buying this land from the state. Secondly, you should consider also that this is a package of measures. This will be not only one, but this will be few of these incentives I just listed. And this package of measure sometimes is difficult to be measured in terms of amount. For the EU country, also the percentage of this state incentive should be carefully calculated, because if certain levels are reached, it could be necessary. The European authorities need to be notified, and the procedure for screening and approval may need to pass. We try to give you some formula about how the state incentives are calculated, and as you can see, it is very important to see the investment amount and the percentage of the eligible expenditure. For Romania, we saw that the state is inclined to give a state incentive even up to 50%. And we give also some example regarding Serbia. 25% of the eligible cost could be returned back for an investment which is around 50 million. Second question is eligible investment. The investor should meet certain criterion and should show a commitment to the market. That's why it's understandable that the legislation are often inserting certain requirements regarding the period for maintenance of the investment. Second thing, which is also very much important for the state, is the employment of the people. It is a long-term shot. Some of the state grants are related to the education of the people. So the state is investing in these people. That's why they require the investor to maintain the employment level for a certain period of time. We give you an example. For example, it could be between 3 to 5 year maintenance of this employment. Speaking about commitment, it is not only about the timing which is important, but also the commitment to a certain amount of investment. That's why participating with all resources in the investment is of a key importance, and this is also understandable. Although some of the investments are meeting these criteria, there should be some restriction of these eligible investments, which is very much related to the status of the investor. For example, this investor should not be in a liquidation or insolvency proceeding. There should be no conviction for crime, or there should be no outstanding obligations against the municipality and the state, because this will make no sense for the state to support activities of such type of companies. As a part of the state incentives, these are the creations of special zones. This could be industry zones, like for example in Bulgaria. This could be industrial parks, like for example in Romania. In these zones, the investors may enjoy a very well developed infrastructure. These zones allow also the investor to buy the properties, as mentioned some minutes ago, at preferential prices. And also, the state is supporting the companies which are located within these zones with logistics and transport. And they will receive an enhanced administrative support, which is also important for some of the jurisdiction in our region, not to have this delay in communicating with the administrative authorities. In some jurisdictions, like for example Romania, the investors are encouraged to invest and they to develop this industrial park. And this investment is also treated like an investment which is subject to state incentives. Further, there are certain customs and fiscal benefits which are available for the businesses. And the investors may benefit in case they decided to locate their facilities, their new mills within these zones. I can give you a few key ways from all this information now. So when you're entering a new market, stay aware about the existence of state incentives. Have a meeting with the state authorities. Ask them questions. Request them to have an individual approach for you and ask them to support your expansion in case you are meeting their criterion to be innovative, creative, different. So I give you the floor now to my colleague Larissa, and she will be speaking about cybersecurity, data protection, which are very hot topic in these days.
Hello, everyone. My name is Larissa Gabudanu, and I am going to speak today a bit about the cybersecurity aspects that you should have in mind. Let's say from the outset when creating your product or service and when entering the market. My presentation is going to include four sections. The first one will detail a bit the types of data that are being collected in the automotive sector, so the specific data that you are gathering in this industry. The second section will detail a bit the various legal implications in terms of cybersecurity that you have to take into account. The first section will discuss a bit about the NIS Directive, which is an EU directive on cybersecurity, recently implemented in the member states. And in the first fourth section, I'll discuss a case study just to see exactly from the technical part up to the legal part what cybersecurity entails. Okay, so in terms of types of data that are being collected, I would start with one comparison. For instance, it has been said that a smart car produces around 4 terabytes of data in 1.5 hours of driving, whereas a plane creates only 0.5 terabytes per flight. So you can see the huge amount of data that is being created in the automotive sector. In terms of types of data that are being generated, I've identified four different types. The first one is the one related to identification. So this is for the purpose of accessing the vehicle. Unu, doi, unu, doi.
Can you hear her? Hello? Hello, Denisa? Can you hear her? Okay. Did you make her?
Da, sunt.
Yes. Can you see her screen? Nu scrie acolo dacă te pot auzi. Și just questions. E amazing. The people are answering in the question.
Da, pot să sun de pe mobil. Să vorbesc de pe mobil, că era un număr de telefon. În cel mai rău caz.
All the people can hear her, so she can continue.
Deci, ei mă aud? Ah, ok.
I will shadow you.
Okay, so maybe just to proceed on the types of data that are being collected. Aside from the ones relating to the access, like facial recognition or other types of sensors that identify the, let's say the driver, you can also have location information, and this relates to a various amount of things, from the destination, how long does it take to go from one place to another, including matters relating to the surrounding of the path. The other two types of data collector refer to experience preferences. So this is essentially creating sort of a profile of the individual using the vehicle or individuals, from air conditioning to temperature and to music. And the last type would be the profile of the driver, which can relate, for instance, if you have specific sensors to very specific matters relating to the driver, including perhaps some health data. And I'm mentioning this specifically because generally in the legislation, health data is considered a special type of data, which has very specific manners in which it can be processed. Now, in terms of data, it is important to view this from different angles. So you can view it strictly from the cybersecurity side, but you can also view it from the other legal provisions existing in a legislation in a country. I would say that it is very important to know exactly what type of data you are collecting, where is your data coming from, and where the data is being transferred to. In terms of contractual relations with your co-contractors, which can be either the manufacturers of the vehicles, or perhaps another software company that is creating part of the software in the vehicle, or subcontractors of yours for the part that you are doing, for the service that you are providing. It is essential to determine exactly the ownership of the data and the liability issues. So it is important to divide the liability issues for each player that is involved in the process. This is essential to be done at the outset of creating the device or the service in order to be very clear later on when the various products are placed in the market. Another important thing to take into account are the trade secrets. In the EU, there is a directive on trade secrets that is currently being implemented in all of the member states. And of course, this is relevant because of all of the know-how that has to be protected, all of the know-how relating to the creation of the solution or of the service that you are providing. Of course, as in other sectors, it is important to follow up on competition law matters. So know exactly what are say your competitors, if you have any restrictions entering the market, what information you can share or not with your competitors, and whether, for instance, you are actually in a position to have, let's say, most of the market in a specific sector, to have a dominant position. Employment law, the manner in which you relate to the employees performing the creating the software and all of the services is also important, and this ties in a bit with the trade secrets legislation as well. For future reference and for, let's say, customer care, it is also important to have in mind a tamper prevention. So the mechanisms from a technical perspective to prevent tampering of the various software and data storages in the automotive sector. A mechanism to be able to use such data as evidence in a court of law. I'm mentioning this because in the later stages of developing the product, this may be useful for consumers and for yourself and for the other players as well. In terms of the data regulation itself, so specific legislations that relate to data, I would mention just a couple of principles that are included in the EU legislation, but from what I understand are also being mirrored in the other non-EU legislations. I understand that in Serbia, for instance, there is an advanced draft relating to data protection that tries to mirror a bit the EU legislation. As main principles, I would mention transparency. So when processing data, the person whose data is being processed, the individual, has to know exactly the manner in which the data is being processed. Accountability. This relates to the ownership of liability of the entity that is processing the data in case of a data breach, for instance. So you have to have in place policies and procedures in this respect, and I will touch upon such policies and procedures in the next slide. And I would say a very important principle is the data minimization principle. The data minimization principle relates to the use of personal data that is strictly required for a specific task. So you should try to avoid using data that it is not specifically needed for that task. It may be useful also to know a bit about the legislation, the specific legislation of your co-contractors. So, for instance, for ICPs, there is a very specific legislation also in terms of handling data. So, whenever you are having a partnership with an ICP, you should have this in mind. And on the data transfers, I would just point out that it is important to understand from a legal perspective how you can transfer data to another entity, especially if this is done in a cross-border manner. Because it may have an impact on the legislation that is being applicable, either the legislation from the state that you are in or the legislation from the state where the respective entity is being situated. And also there are various steps that would need to be taken when transferring data cross-border. So especially if you are transferring from the EU to a non-EU country, this becomes very, very relevant. And I would underline a bit also the secondary use of data. So generally, if you collect data that is personal data pertaining to an individual, it is very important to know exactly the steps to be taken for reusing this data for another purpose. For instance, if you are collecting data for the use of the vehicle, and you later on want to use the data for marketing or insurance, then you need to take some additional steps in terms of consent from the individual and other such steps for using the data for the secondary use. Now, moving on a bit to the cybersecurity specifics. For the cybersecurity legislation and standards, I would like to point out a couple of things. From the legislation side, I would mention the sensitive data. So when dealing with health data, specific steps have to be taken, such as the consent of the individual, and there are tighter constraints when trying to create a profile of the individual based on health data. For the cybersecurity legislation, it is relevant to know a bit about the NIS Directive, the Cybersecurity Directive, which I'm going to detail a bit in the next slide. And from a criminal law perspective, it is relevant to understand a bit the manner in which you can access an IT system and extract data from that IT system, as in most of the jurisdictions, unauthorized accessing of an IT system or transferring data from that IT system without a specific right is considered a criminal offense. So it is important to have in mind for the cybersecurity aspects as well, the different points of view of all of the stakeholders involved. So this includes hardware producers, manufacturers of the vehicles themselves, maintenance services, and other service providers involved. Now going a bit from the legislation to the standards and the good practice in terms of cybersecurity. There are a couple of risks that I've saw are generally mentioned in all of the white papers and standards that are specific for this field. And these relate, first of all, to the failure of software. The second risk relates to the failure of the network itself. The third risk entails the involvement of a third party. So the situation whereby you have a hacking incident or a cyber crime incident. And the third one relates to the implementation choice. So for certain do-it-yourself solutions, even if the software is provided to the client, the implementation aspects are left to the client. So these are, let's say, the four main areas that I've identified as crucial when creating a cybersecurity policy. In terms of guidance in this respect, I've noticed that most of the associations in the automotive sector have white papers and suggestions for risk assessment and risk management. I'll just mention a couple: the Automotive Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the International Transport Forum, the European Automobile Manufacturers Association, and the Society of Automotive Engineering. So I would say that these provide very good practices and are working also on some standards in the field. In terms of risks, risk mitigation, let's say, there are a couple of points to be considered. You can have an layered solution. So try to isolate the critical controls from the non-essential systems, so that if the non-essential systems are affected, the critical controls are still in place. You can try to have a full life cycle solution. So this means that in case of aside from the initial settings, you can also facilitate a rapid response and recovery in case of cybersecurity incidents. And of course, there is the matter of the data location, whether this can be located at the level of the software application or sensor, or later on in the cloud, and so on. So it depends on where you have the location and the manner in which you try to secure the communication between the device and the storage place. I would also mention that authentication and confidentiality are essential in this respect. Now, moving on a bit to the NIS Directive. This is relevant for the automotive sector as it is listed as one of the sectors for applicability of the NIS Directive. So basically, for intelligent transport systems, the NIS Directive becomes applicable, and perhaps relevant for this sector is also the cloud computing part, as some of the data may be stored in the cloud. For the NIS Directive, it becomes applicable to operators of essential services, which are defined in the directive as fulfilling three criteria. The first one being that the service is essential. The second one being that it uses a network and information system. And the third one being that an incident involving this operator would generate significant disruptive effects. Now, these definitions may seem a bit general, but they are detailed in the secondary legislation in each of the member states. So the authorities in each of the member states have detailed these and have explained how to use them. Now, moving on a bit to the obligations of such operators under the NIS Directive, you'd say that the obligations are aimed first at the prevention part, so preventing any data breaches, but also on incident handling. So the idea is to cover both areas. Now, for the prevention part, articles that detail the auditing. So each entity falling under the NIS Directive will be subject to a prior auditing from a specialized authorized IT auditor. which will then generate the registration of the operator of essential services in a national register in each of the member states. And for the second part, you would have various policies and procedures in place in order to minimize the impact of security incidents. But also a mechanism within the country to notify these incidents. It is relevant to mention that each of the member states will have a national authority dealing with the cybersecurity part. So both for the prevention and creation of the national registers, but also for incident response teams and maybe some remedial steps. Also at the EU level, ENISA most probably will be in a position to have a new role overseeing the manner in which each member state is performing this. I've mentioned here a bit a case study, maybe to bring together the first part with the types of data that are generated in the automotive industry, and move it a bit to understand the legal implications in case of a data incident. So I chose one of the examples from the ENISA good practice guide. The man-in-the-middle attack. This is considered by ENISA as being a medium-level risk factor. So with a good probability of occurring. This generally is seen also as a session hijacking, as it is an attack at the level of the communication. So basically, a person, a third party, tries to penetrate the communication between a user and the vehicle, for instance, and can make the two size, the user and the vehicle, think that he is the counterparty. So he can interact with both of them and try to manipulate the manner in which the vehicle operates. This attack can occur at the software level, so software components or software embedded in hardware, but also at through the communication channels that are not properly, let's say, encrypted. From economical and technical perspective, this has a great impact, as it would affect all of the communication networks and all of the assets, including all of the data that is being held, for instance, in that vehicle. And this kind would tie in and would trigger the liability from, depending on the exact data breach, car manufacturers or service providers, the tier 1, which are providing the services directly to the manufacturers, or tier 2, which are providing the software service to the tier 1 software providers. But also the customers, the leasing companies, and the insurance companies. So all of these players could potentially be affected and involved and held liable in certain cases for such data breach, depending on the manner in which this was initially set out and structured. Now, from a technical perspective, a good practice to avoid such a data breach involves cryptography, communication protection, and identification, and authentication and authorization for all of the actions. But this translates into also some legal implications. On the one hand, you have the cybersecurity legislation on data breaches. You have the data protection legislation on data breaches. So you have to have these two in mind when a man-in-the-middle attack occurs. but also you have to have in mind the commercial liability for the IT security for, in terms of the data breach. So the players that were involved in creating the ecosystem that was attacked will need to figure out exactly who will be liable for the damages that were incurred by the customer or by third parties, and so on. So this is just an example to see from a practical data breach how the legal aspects kind of fit into the scheme. So this was from my side. If you have any questions, you can ask in the chat section of the software. And now I'm going to give the floor back to Antonia.
Thank you very much, Larissa. I will also encouraging you to send us questions in case you have, or in case you would like on some of the topics we to further elaborate. At the end, I would like to share with you an example of very successful story of a company entering foreign markets. This is the story of Visteon, the automotive company. And as you can see, they managed to become a market leader for a very short period of time. So with this video, we would like to thank you for your attention and to encouraging you to send us question, feedback in order to step back on this and to make our second session, which is now scheduled for the 29th of November. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy the successful story of Visteon in Bulgaria.
You know that it's very likely the dashboard in your car was made by Visteon Bulgaria. Currently create the highest technological cockpit. Visteon is one of the biggest suppliers in the world of automotive electronics and the only one to be extremely focused on cockpit electronics and connectivity, the key to the automobiles of the future. The core of Visteon Bulgaria is its technology center with its nearly 1,000 employees with knowledge in the fields of software, hardware and mechanics. This is the second biggest deployment center of Visteon, where currently over 30 projects are created and developed for millions of cars of various makes and models. Visteon develops systems for industrial clusters, displays, onboard electronics, connectivity, and entertainment on board the car. Testing and production validation direction deals with the development of automated tests on the basis of specifications with technical requirements. Visteon deals not only with software development of products, but is also responsible for the mechanical design and module development for the automotive industry, CAD models and drawings. The hardware department includes architectural design and its implementation. It assists the teams that develop the products with various activities, such as circuit boards, tests in specific environment, analysis of electromagnetic compatibility and mechanics, creation of prototypes, and analysis of optics. Visteon creates and supplies a wide range of dashboards, from economically advantageous solutions to multi-processor devices with high-resolution dual TFT color displays. Visteon display systems continuously strive to decrease the load for the driver and respectively increase the pleasure of driving. Electronic systems control modules perform a wide set of tasks, including control of the cabin lighting, door locking mechanisms, or windscreen wipers. Usually this is the device with the most connections to other devices in the automobile. Control of the whole interior electronics requires hardware that keeps its high reliability in a wide range of operating conditions. Visteon System SmartCore has its debut in the new A-Class Mercedes-Benz. This is the industry's first controller for the consolidation of all functions with infotainment electronic systems in the cockpit. This product is absolutely innovative, thanks to the concept of merging graphic information of various systems and presenting it in various forms to the driver and passengers. Visteon knows how to do that, and the first-class automobile producers appreciate it.